Okay, we are ready to start. Welcome, everybody. My name is Rami Khoury. I'm a senior fellow at the Islam Faris Institute, and it's a pleasure to have you all. This is a bit like after these 3 days of amazing discussions and papers, this is like extra time in a football game. You get a bonus, one more last session, and it's going to be an interesting one with the subject of regional and global polarization and the impact on the development of the Arab revolutions and, of course, the post-revolutions. Each speaker will have, there's 4 speakers, 2 of them are speaking together as one paper, 4 papers. Each will have 15 minutes. We'll be very strict and equitable and democratic, so each will have the same time. They'll get a 2-minute warning, and then when they hit 15 minutes, I'll make a signal. All of you should stand up and start waving your hands and clapping. So we'll have an hour for the 4 papers, and then 40 minutes for discussion. And then the director of the Islam Faris Institute, Dr. Tariq Mitri, will make some closing comments. So you have the paper summaries in your booklets, you have the biographies, so we won't go through them. I invite the first speaker, Dr. Yasser Jazairy, to take the floor.
الخير. دراسة سياسة الولايات المتحدة تجاه الثورات العربية دون وضعها في سياق أسباب فشل هذه الثورات ما عدا التونسية سيؤدي إلى سوء فهم هذا البحث وإدراجه ضمن خطاب منتشر يضخم دور الولايات المتحدة في المنطقة. لذلك يجب الإشارة إلى أن هذا البحث يشكل فصل من فصول سياسة الاحتواء، وأن الدور الذي لعبته الولايات المتحدة أقل أهمية من العوامل الأخرى، وهي التحارب الإيديولوجي، السياسات العربية، وظهور تنظيم الدولة. بل أن الدور الأمريكي لم يكن لينجح لولا هذه العوامل الثلاث. لأسباب جيوسياسية تركز هذه الدراسة على سياسة الولايات المتحدة تجاه الثورة السورية، وتقدم قراءة تقول بأن هناك استراتيجية تتبعها الولايات المتحدة، وأن هذه الاستراتيجية كانت قد نشأت قبل الثورة ولكنها أصبحت أكثر أهمية لأنها أضحت أداة ليس فقط لاحتواء الثورة السورية بل أيضا لمواجهة التغير الذي كان قد حصل في تركيا في 2003. هذه الاستراتيجية هي في الحقيقة مزيج من الاستراتيجيات التي يناصرها جون ميرشهايمر وإدوارد لوتواك، وهما 2 من كبار منظري الاستراتيجيات والعلاقات الدولية. المحاضرة التي ألقاها فرانك ويزنر أمام المركز الوطني للدراسات الأمنية في إسرائيل في أيار مايو 2011 تلقي الضوء على 3 نقاط هامة بالنسبة للولايات المتحدة والثورات العربية. ويزنر كان سفير الولايات المتحدة في مصر من 86 وحتى 91، وهو المبعوث الذي أرسله أوباما إلى مصر بعد اندلاع الثورات لحث مبارك على إجراء تغييرات جذرية. أشار ويزنر في محاضراته إلى كتاب جورج أنطونيوس الصحوة العربية، وقال بأن العالم العربي يعيش صحوة ثانية ضربها طويل ونتيجتها مجهولة، وأضاف أن انعكاس هذه الصحوة على أمريكا وإسرائيل سيكون عميقا وسيغير توازن القوى في الإقليم. ونبه ويزنر جمهوره قائلا: نحن جميعا ضعفنا بسبب ذلك. ويزنر يقرأ الثورات كتغير سلبي بالنسبة للولايات المتحدة وإسرائيل، ويضع كلا البلدين في البوتقة نفسها، أي أن ويزنر لا يفصل بين إسرائيل والولايات المتحدة عندما يتكلم عن الشرق الأوسط، مما يعني تداخل ما هو إقليمي إسرائيل مع ما هو عالمي الولايات المتحدة. بدأت الثورات العربية بعد 4 أشهر من انسحاب القوات الأمريكية من العراق. بعد خسارتها لحرب العراق عادت الولايات المتحدة إلى سياسة تشبه لحد ما سياستها بعد خسارة حرب فيتنام. ففي ذلك الوقت ظهر مبدأ نيكسون دكترين الذي هدف إلى إنقاذ تواجد الولايات المتحدة في المناطق الاستراتيجية واعتمادها بدل ذلك على قوى محلية. وقد اتخذت أمريكا إيران كرجلها القوي في منطقة الخليج في ذلك الوقت. وفي ذلك الوقت أيضا أطلق كيسنجر عبارته الشهيرة: إيران هي الحليف الطبيعي للولايات المتحدة. بعد أن وصلت حرب العراق إلى أوج فشلها في 2007 أعاد توماس فريدمان طرح عبارة كيسنجر في مقالة شجبت السعودية وامتدحت إيران. كيسنجر بنفسه أعاد طرح هذه العبارة في كل ظهور إعلامي خلال النقاش الذي دار في الولايات المتحدة في 2014 حول محادثات برنامج إيران النووي. وفي كتابه الجديد النظام العالمي World Order يقول كيسنجر بأن دور أمريكا الجديد في الشرق الأوسط يجب أن يكون دور الموازن بالانسر، وأن أمريكا يجب أن تكون أقرب من كل طرف العربي والإيراني من قرب الطرفين من بعضهما. وكانت الرسالة السرية التي أرسلها أوباما لخامنئي في تشرين الأول أكتوبر 2014 عارضا عليه الشراكة في الحرب على داعش في العراق وسوريا مقابل التوصل إلى اتفاق حول برنامج إيران النووي أحد الخطوات التي اتخذها الرئيس الأمريكي للتوصل لهذه الغاية. بعد فوز أوباما في الانتخابات الرئاسية وقبل دخوله البيت الأبيض بشهر، نشر مفكر الاستراتيجيات وأستاذ العلوم السياسية في جامعة شيكاغو جون ميرشهايمر في مجلة نيوزويك مقالة بعنوان عودة إلى التوازن الخارجي. أنا ترجمت كلمة التوازن الخارجي، هو المبدأ يسمى باللغة الإنجليزية offshore balancing. إذا أحد عنده ترجمة أفضل من ترجمتي فتفضلوا من فضلكم. دعا فيها أوباما إلى العودة إلى استراتيجية التوازن الخارجي التي تبنتها أمريكا خلال الحرب الباردة. هذه الاستراتيجية تعني أن الولايات المتحدة تسحب قواعدها من المناطق المهمة بالنسبة لها وتستخدم القوى المحلية لكي توازن بعضها البعض، وتتدخل فقط عندما يختل توازن القوى في المنطقة. وأعطى ميرشهايمر مثالا كيف استخدمت أمريكا العراق لاحتواء الثورة الإيرانية، ولكنها هاجمت العراق عندما احتل الكويت. يقول ميرشهايمر: هذه الاستراتيجية ستشجع القوى الإقليمية على التنافس لجذب الولايات المتحدة إلى طرفها ومن خلال ذلك ستسهل استراتيجية فرق تسد، نهاية الاقتباس. في مقابلة أجراها ديفيد رومنيك محرر مجلة نيويوركر مع أوباما في كانون الثاني 2014، قال أوباما: بإمكانك أن ترى توازن يتطور بين دول الخليج السنية أو ذات الأغلبية السنية وإيران، وأن يكون في هذا التوازن تنافس أو ربما شك، ولكن بدون حرب سواء كانت بشكل مباشر أو بالوكالة، نهاية الاقتباس. يضيف أوباما بأن النظام القديم، التوازن القديم، لم يعد بالإمكان الحفاظ عليه، نهاية الاقتباس مرة أخرى. على عكس ما يطلبه ميرشهايمر، وعلى عكس ما يشاع عن أن الولايات المتحدة أقل اهتماما الآن بالشرق الأوسط وتتجه إلى الشرق الأقصى، فإن أوباما أو أي رئيس أمريكي آخر لن يغلق القواعد الأمريكية في الخليج أو في أي منطقة أخرى مهمة بالنسبة لأمريكا، ولكن ما قاله أوباما عن التوازن والشك هو بالضبط ما دعا له ميرشهايمر وكيسنجر. هدف أي استراتيجية هي تقوية الدولة. يقول ميرشهايمر في شرحه للنظرية الواقعية في العلاقات الدولية بأن هناك 4 استراتيجيات تتبعها الدولة لتصبح أقوى. الأولى هي الحرب، والثانية هي الابتزاز أي تهديد الخصم بحرب ضده، أما الثالثة فهي إيقاع الخصم في طعم وجعله ينزف، والمصطلح الذي يستخدمه هو bait and bleed. وهذا ما فعلته الولايات المتحدة مع الاتحاد السوفيتي في أفغانستان. في مقابلة مطولة لقناة بلومبرغ مع أوباما أجراها الصحفي الأمريكي الإسرائيلي جيفري جولدبرغ في 27 من شباط 2014، شرح أوباما كيف أن سياسته في سوريا تضعف إيران وروسيا. إنها أي الحرب في سوريا تجعلهم ينزفون أي الإيرانيين، لأن عليهم أن يرسلوا مليارات الدولارات. وكيلهم الرئيسي حزب الله الذي كان يحظى بموقع مريح وقوي جدا يجد الآن نفسه مهاجما من قبل سنة متعصبون. هذا ليس جيد بالنسبة لإيران، هم يخسرون مثل الجميع. الروس يجدون صديقهم الوحيد في المنطقة سوريا في حطام وبدون شرعية، نهاية الاقتباس. يقول مايكل أورن سفير إسرائيل لدى الولايات المتحدة من 2009 وحتى 2013 في كتابه حليف الذي ظهر العام الماضي أن جيفري جولدبرغ هو الصحفي الذي يختاره أوباما كلما أراد توجيه رسالة للجمهور الإسرائيلي. أوباما لا يوضح من هم الجميع الذين يخسرون. داني دانون الذي أصبح في 2015 سفير إسرائيل لدى الأمم المتحدة بعد أن كان عضوا في حزب الليكود في الكنيست، كتب في المجلة الأمريكية السياسة الخارجية Foreign Policy في تشرين الثاني 2013 أن إسرائيل هي من ربحت الربيع العربي، وأنها أقوى مما كانت عليه قبل اندلاع هذه الثورات، وذلك بسبب تورط حزب الله في سوريا وتدمير أنفاق غزة بعد الانقلاب في مصر. أي أن الجميع يخسرون، تعني كل دول المنطقة ما عدا إسرائيل. مثال آخر على خسارة الجميع هو ما حدث لسياسة تركيا الخارجية بعد ثورات 2011. ففي مقالته الشهيرة سياسة تركيا الخارجية بدون مشاكل، أو بلا مشاكل، التي نشرت 6 أشهر قبل انطلاق الاحتجاجات في تونس، أعلن وزير خارجية تركيا أحمد داوود أولو أن تركيا لم تعد مجرد جناح في حلف الشمال الأطلسي، بل أصبحت لاعبا رئيسيا في الإقليم والنظام العالمي. ولكن بعد اندلاع الثورات بعامين كتب مراسل أمريكي متهكما في نفس المجلة أن تركيا انتقلت من موقع بلا مشاكل إلى وضع بلا أصدقاء. وبعد انطلاق العمليات الروسية في سوريا في أيلول 2015 صرحت رويترز بأن تركيا أصبحت بلا قوة في وجه روسيا. لم تسأل رويترز كيف أصبحت تركيا بلا قوة أمام روسيا وهي تركيا عضو في أكبر وأقوى تحالف في العالم. الاستراتيجية الرابعة التي يدرجها ميرشهايمر من أجل جعل الدولة أقوى هي مساعدة الخصوم على أن يذبحوا بعضهم، وهو يسميها bloodletting. يعطي ميرشهايمر مثالا على هذه الاستراتيجية ما قاله هاري ترومان عندما كان عضوا في مجلس الشيوخ وقبل أن يصبح رئيسا للولايات المتحدة. فحين أعلنت ألمانيا النازية الحرب على الاتحاد السوفيتي في عام 1941 قال ترومان ما يلي: إذا رأينا ألمانيا تربح الحرب فيجب أن نساعد روسيا، وإذا رأينا روسيا تربح الحرب يجب أن نساعد ألمانيا. بهذه الطريقة دعوهم يقتلوا أكبر عدد ممكن. نهاية الاقتباس. طبق إدوارد لوتواك فكرة ترومان على سوريا في مقالة نشرتها النيويورك تايمز في 2013 بعنوان أمريكا تخسر في سوريا إذا ربح أحد الطرفين. أثنى لوتواك وهو من اليمين المتطرف وشديد العداء لأوباما على سياسة أوباما الديمقراطي في سوريا، قائلا إن هذه السياسة تجعل 4 من خصوم الولايات المتحدة منشغلين في قتال بعضهم البعض. لذلك يتابع لوتواك على الولايات المتحدة إطالة أمد هذه الحرب إلى ما لا نهاية، والكلمة الإنجليزية an indefinite draw، من خلال مساعدة المعارضة عندما يربح الأسد وإيقاف هذا الدعم عندما يخسر الأسد. بالمناسبة إدوارد لوتواك هو ليس الوحيد. أنا في البحث أدرجت مجموعة من الكتاب والسياسيون الأمريكيون والإسرائيليون الذين يعيدون نفس الشيء، وأعطي فقط مثال واحد: ريك لاري وهو محرر الجريدة اليمينية في الولايات المتحدة ناشونال ريفيو، كان قد صرح في 2 مارس آذار 2012، يعني بعد مرور سنة على الثورة، كان قد قال باللغة الإنجليزية We want this conflict to burn on. أترجم إلى العربية: نريد لهذا الصراع أن يستمر في الاحتراق. في كتابه أعود الآن إلى لوتواك. في كتابه الاستراتيجية الكبرى للإمبراطورية البيزنطينية الذي نشر في 2011 يقول لوتواك أن الإمبراطورية التي لا تستطيع إحراز انتصار حاسم مثل أمريكا في العراق عليها اتباع سياسة الحد الأقصى من المناورة والحد الأدنى من الاستنزاف. هذه السياسة تتحقق عندما تنجح الإمبراطورية في جعل أعدائها يحاربون بعضهم البعض. هذا بالضبط ما عبر عنه أوباما عندما قال الجميع يخسرون. لوتواك هو أحد كبار مفكري الاستراتيجيات، إذ يدرس كتابه استراتيجي في الجامعات والكليات العسكرية، وكان قد عمل مستشارا للجيش الأمريكي ووزارتي الدفاع والخارجية، وهو عضو في بعض أكبر مراكز الأبحاث في الولايات المتحدة، مثل مركز الدراسات الاستراتيجية والدولية في جامعة جورج تاون، ومؤسسة هوفر في جامعة ستانفورد، ومعهد واشنطن الذي أسسه اللوبي الإسرائيلي أيباك. وكان لوتواك قد حصل على شهادة شكر من إسرائيل لمساهمته في تصميم دبابة الميركافا. صحيفة الجارديان البريطانية سمته في مقابلة نشرت في كانون الأول ديسمبر 2015 مستشار الرؤساء والوزراء. كان لوتواك في البداية من معارضي حرب العراق التي سماها خطأ ثمنه $1 تريليون، ولكنه غير رأيه، وفي المقابلة مع جارديان قال ما يلي: لم أعطي جورج دبليو بوش ما يستحق من التقدير على ما قام به في الشرق الأوسط. لقد أخفقت في ذلك الوقت في فهم أنه عبقري استراتيجي أعظم من بسمارك، فقد أشعل حربا دينية بين السنة والشيعة ستشغل المنطقة ل1000 سنة. لقد كانت ضربة عبقرية. نهاية الاقتباس. إصرار لوتواك على تصوير ما يحدث في المنطقة كحرب طائفية يوازي ما قاله أوباما في خطاب حالة الاتحاد الذي ألقاه في 12 من كانون الثاني 2016، أي قبل 11 يوم. قال أوباما: الشرق الأوسط يشهد تغيرات ستستمر لجيل. جذور هذه التغيرات هي نزاعات تعود لآلاف السنين. نهاية الاقتباس. لوتواك وأوباما كلاهما يصران على قراءة أحداث المنطقة من وجهة نظر طائفية، ما قاله أوباما مأخوذ من الخطاب الاستشراقي الذي أمضى برنارد لويس حياته الأكاديمية وهو يسوقه، فبينما يتقدم الغرب ويتطور تحت شعارات مثل البحث العلمي والحرية وحقوق الإنسان، يجد الشرق الأوسط نفسه حسب ما قال أوباما حبيس صراعات استمرت ل1000 سنين، ويأمل لطوك أن تستمر ل1000 سنة أخرى. في مقابلته مع مجلة النيويوركر قال أوباما أن 5 سنوات في البيت الأبيض جعلته أكثر فهما وتقديرا لقوة التاريخ الجارفة. هل من تعليل لدى أوباما لماذا يبدو التاريخ قوة جارفة في الغرب بينما يبدو دوامة مغرقة في الشرق الأوسط؟ في الختام أعود إلى محاضرة ويزنر. روى ويزنر أن كيسنجر قال له ما يلي: إذا استطعت أن تقارن هذه الفترة في العالم العربي مع نهاية الحرب الباردة وسقوط حائط برلين فنحن يا فرانك موسكو. نهاية الاقتباس. من المهم للإدارة الأمريكية وكل من رأى مصالحه مهددة بالثورات العربية ألا نقارن ما حدث في الدول العربية مع ما حصل في شرق أوروبا، وأن نتكلم بدل ذلك عن الصراعات الطائفية، لأننا لو فعلنا ستكون الولايات المتحدة في الشرق الأوسط ما كان الاتحاد السوفيتي في شرق أوروبا. شكرا.
أتكلم العربية. ولكن
Just 1 second. Let me fix this. Oh, you can start. Jewish.
ولكن يتكلم الناس. So the rest of the talk will be in English unless Fuad wants to change. We're okay? In the nutshell, our talk is to think about how foreign influence on Arab countries is affecting them and affecting some of the internal politics. So in a nutshell, we think that this foreign influence is contributing to some of the instability and therefore to some of the skepticism and doubt and mistrust in Arab countries. I'll go into a little more detail about this idea. We're interested in how the foreign influence is influencing internal domestic politics and regional politics. For example, we think this helps, as many people have said at the conference, to establish frontier relationships within and factional alliances that can be within and between borders and economic hegemony by some states and people within and outsiders. And those, we know in political psychology, are going to have psychological consequences on the population because this is the context in which people are living. So we'll show you in particular that it produces a sense of insecurity, of uncertainty, and mistrust in many directions. And we don't mean this in a clinical psychological sense, just in a social sense. So then another way to analyze how this happens at the inside countries level is that all of those psychological states are bred by and contribute back to corruption within the states, to people feeling ambivalent about different political movements, and to sort of skepticism that things could improve or trust in the principles and whether they can ever be realized. And we think that this happens really regardless of support. So of very widespread support for democratic principles, which we'll show you. So just to clue you about what kind of foreign influence we mean, of course, American and military intervention is quite infamous, but in addition to that, many Arab countries have a lot of non-governmental organizations, international organizations, the strong hand of many multinational corporations that, as far as I can tell, no one governs. There's political violence that is contributed to with direct and indirect armament. And then a lot of the economies of several Arab countries are dependent on exports, and so that depends a lot on how much money other people have. Tourism is also quite vulnerable to the economic states of other countries, and as we all know, there's some very globalized political issues in Arab countries. So there's a big wide variety of the nature of external influence. In brief, our research method is we're going to look at public opinion among citizens in Arab countries, and for this we use the Arab Barometer, which I guess until 2 days ago was the largest popular survey of Arabs that anybody could find. We also used a Pew Global survey for comparison with other unstable nations, and some convenience surveys that Fuad and I began at fairly early in the uprisings in 2011. We're looking at that set of psychological processes within the larger context in which the nations are. And so for this we use a lot of objective measures about the state of nations, the Fragile States Index, there's a Corruption Perceptions Index, there's a Human Development Index, there's human rights scores, and so forth. I think in this talk we focus mostly on the Fragile States Index. So they do this every year, and they map the whole world about how stable, which you see in the green end, to unstable that you see in the red end. And you can see that there's actually fairly few states that are considered stable, and a lot in your neighborhood that are not very stable. And as we said, we think that this instability can affect people despite the fact that Arabs, at least the ones who have been surveyed so far, have widespread support for democracy. There's 90% or more of people in all of these countries that say that they would like democracy, that it's a good or a very good thing and appropriate to their country, and so forth. As you know, because you've been listening to 3 days and doing 700 years of research on Arab politics, they're complicated. And all the citizens know that, or at least 2/3. So when in this survey in 3 different years, over 2/3 of the public agreed that politics is so complicated that I cannot understand what is going on. Right, and that kind of thing leads to a level of uncertainty. And we found, in fact, that that's not because people aren't paying attention. People who pay attention to the news and people who don't pay attention to the news endorse this equally. So what about this outside interference? How is that affecting people? Well, you probably know that the ones who are interfering often try to argue that they're doing it to help Arabs or to help the state of the world, right? So since I was in school, there was this slogan, "Be nice to America, or we will bring democracy to your country." And there's a similar kind of cartoon going on with Russia, that Russia is actually helping Crimea by bringing them back home to eat boots. If you ask, though, if you look at what the public is saying, here I'm showing you the relationship between 2 measures that were done in the surveys. And so that's the question, what does this outside influence mean? So we asked, so the questions were, do you think that the neighbors are having a positive or negative influence on democracy in your country? And it was asked about your immediate neighbors, or it was asked about the US and the European Union, which turn out to be the same. And then the other question is, how much freedom are you experiencing within your own country? So there's a bunch of kinds of civic freedoms that were asked. And what happens is, whenever you see lines above the 0 point here, it means that the worse people thought the outside influence was, the less freedom that they had. So in general, that's true. There are some exceptions, but that was true in many countries. Right, so we want to now look at the psychology in more detail, and we're thinking about how foreign influences uncertainty and insecurity, and I'll show you that in a couple of ways, economic and other kinds of threats. So these are the Pew data. So this is showing on the horizontal axis how fragile or unstable is the state, and high means more. And then the questions were we're showing you the average of how much did people rate the United States as a very serious threat to their country. Well, the more they're interfered with in general, the more threat they feel from the US. They didn't ask how much threat you feel from Russia or Iran or anything else, but it wouldn't surprise us if it looked like that. So there's really important differences among countries in the psychology people are experiencing. Similarly, if we look again on the horizontal axis just at the failed state in the fragile state index of how much external intervention, and again of all sorts, people felt their countries were experiencing, and then they were asked how much. What do they expect their economic future to be like? Well, it turns out that we used as a measure of uncertainty how many people wouldn't answer that question. They said, I don't know. I don't know whether it's going to be good or bad. And you can see here again that the more external intervention is, the higher proportion of people who said, I don't know what to tell you about economics. It happens the same way if instead it's the same predictor variable, psychological variable, if you look at how much security each country has. The less secure it is, the more uncertainty the people in it are expressing. Is that my turn? Okay.
Okay, so we've heard that in general, democratic political systems are consensually seen as good. We've also heard that in general, people see these the foreign influences as generally bad, but we also find that there are sophisticated differences between sophisticated discrimination among Arab publics about the differences between the principles of democracy and sovereignty and how they're applied. And also sophisticated distinctions between the system that's being applied and how it's being applied. So for example, when it comes to democracy, the distinction is made in among Arab publics between autocracy as a governmental system and lack of government responsiveness. So in theory, you could have an autocrat who is responsive to the people's demands. And in theory, more than just in theory, you can have politically, electorally democratic systems that do not respond to the demands of their people. So for example, recently a major study came out in the US that shows that the policies of the United States government tend to reflect the preferences of the very wealthy in the US and not so much the less wealthy. And as well, we saw that there's a distinction between neighbor and Western influences among Arab publics. So there's a very sophisticated understanding of systems, principles, and how those things play out in practice in our countries. But in principle, democracy and sovereignty themselves are not among citizens' primary demands. If you look at the Pew data, in fact, those primary demands tend to be provision of public services, transparency and lack of corruption, basic civic freedoms. Among an open-ended list of responses, not one of them is an abstract, principled, or systemic kind of demand. It's very, very concrete. So what we have been thinking is that this rejection of foreign influences, instead of being a principled rejection of influences on the basis of sovereignty, like elites talk about it, it comes partly, at least, from the effects these influences have on other expectations and how the governments themselves in those countries end up providing those services. And I'm going to show you some data about that. So, for example, if you look at the perceptions of government services across 12 Arab states in the Arab Barometer, you'll see that the more external intervention, and by intervention here we reiterate that we're not talking about military intervention only, but in the broader sense of influence in general, the more intervention there is, objectively, the more people thought of government services as being poor. Similarly, the more intervention there was, the more publics in these 12 Arab states that were surveyed in Pew distrusted those governments. This is a scale where the higher it is, the more mistrust there is. An even closer relationship between corruption perceptions and external intervention. An 82, a correlation of 82 is quite rare in social science, except between GDP and other objective indices. To have a corruption perception index and an objective index correlate to this degree means that there's at least if not a causative association, then an associational construct or cluster that binds them together in some way. And this brings us back to our overall idea that foreign influences, as well as directly affecting psychological consequences, like we've already said, and affecting domestic politics, there's a feedback system between all of these influences, so that insecurity and uncertainty and mistrust feed back into the domestic political system, increase polarization, increase corruption, and increase problems in the rentier relations, for example, between elites in Arab and other unstable countries and elites in more hegemonic or dominant countries that are intervening or using their influence in those countries. So, in general, major powers use positive justifications, like we mentioned earlier, like you're going to benefit others through your influence in the world. And they use humanitarian or egalitarian justifications for interventions. But from our perspective, from the perspective of peoples in target countries, we who directly experience the effects, the consequences of these, and have for many generations, these don't seem very credible to us. But we have to recognize also that the publics in the countries that are intervening have not experienced instability the same way we have, do not often hear about the negative consequences or see the connection between those negative consequences and their interventions or their influences, especially when those influences are through what they're called, what's called soft power, not the obvious military intervention so much, but also through economics or media or so on. So in this context where publics in major powers think that what they're doing is for beneficial reasons, and on the other hand, we think that that's unlikely to be the only case. In some cases that might be true to some degree. It is not surprising when you ask people about how they feel about the uprisings in 2011 in our convenience surveys, that you see that in stable states in general, and this is not just Arab states, in general you find that stable states find that or think that the uprisings will benefit Arab people. And at the same time that they won't benefit major powers like the American people. Whereas if you look at the more unstable states, you find that there is not this belief that these uprisings will bring any benefit. There's no disagreement with that idea, but there's that uncertainty. We don't really know whether this is going to be a good thing or not. And this brings us to how people feel about these uprisings. And we know from collective action psychology that you need a level of emotional connection to collective action movements for you to participate in them. So we looked at both negative and positive feelings. In more stable countries, we find that it's almost entirely positive. People have very positive feelings about those uprisings. And this was 2011, 2012, and might have changed since then. But in general, the idea is, in less stable countries, we have more ambivalence, we have more skepticism, we have more uncertainty. And so even in our emotions, we're more complex. We have both positive and negative feelings at the same time. If you, for example, take a look at the right-hand column. So in summary, foreign influences increase people's sense of threat and uncertainty. This threat and uncertainty in political change settings lead us to emotional ambivalence and can curb activism and can change even the strategies of activism. We don't talk about this in this paper, but there's plenty of work going on that. In terms of implications, we also have to think about the interventionist states' publics and how those governments market intervention and influence abroad to their own people. They get very simplistic ideas of what their governments are doing in terms of their foreign policy. And the data reflect that. So they need more sophisticated perspectives about their own and others' political systems. So, for example, if you ask Americans whether they think their country is democratic, most of them will say yes, even though objectively it is not. It is oligarchic. In terms of others, also in terms of what instability, foreign influence, and interventions mean, because having no direct experience, having this marketing campaigns by their governments to them, directed at them, they have no source closer to our opinion and our experience and our understanding of what it really means to experience outside influence to inform their decisions and their preferences when they go to the voting booth. The last point, so in conclusion, I think that democratization, because of what we discussed in terms of citizen demands, more concrete, more need-based, more development-based, and also because of the influences of foreign factors. Democratization has to happen in a bottom-up and pragmatic and indigenous approach. And it has to include both cultural, social, and political elements. If you divorce any of those things from another, it's unlikely to have any beneficial consequences in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mورييل أوزبورغ. تفضلي مورييل.
I'm sorry, I'm going to speak from here, and I hope my voice is going to make it through the 15 minutes. I was invited to speak about the EU's role in the Arab uprising and the transition period or transformation period that followed, and I'm very happy to do so. What we saw in 2011 was an enthusiastic welcome, actually, by European parliaments, diplomats, media, publics of the Arab uprisings. And after that, the EU pledged to support transformations in these countries with a lot of different measures and instruments. And yet, when we look at the situation today, we have to say, I think there is no other way than to come to the conclusion that Europeans have not lived up to their promises of supporting democratic transformation. And what happened is rather they have been reduced to being bystanders, not being effective promoters of democracy, not being able to stabilize the region effectively. When we link this to the title of the session, which asks about the impact of foreign or external forces on the Arab revolutions, I would say for Europe we can come to the conclusion that it's not Europe that has impacted on the region, but rather the other way around, that developments in the region have impacted on Europe much more. So why is this the case? This is what I want to look at in my paper. Why did Europeans have so little impact? And in order to answer that question, I want to analyze the EU approaches, the instruments, and the priorities that Europeans have had towards the region, and also how these have changed throughout the last 5 years. Taking us back to 2011, as I said, Europeans in very broad terms were very enthusiastic, welcomed the Arab Spring, and that of course had the background that Europeans finally saw that what they hold dear as values being demanded for by people in the region. So they had the impression these people are just like us, and that changed the image of people in the region dramatically. Now, you might find that funny because you know people in the region, but for Europeans, indeed, the region looked differently in 2011 than it did before. And the conclusion that Europeans took from that is what was going to happen would be similar to what happened in Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The transformation of Central and Eastern Europe towards democracies, or more or less democracies. So against this background, Europeans pledged to support that. kind of transformation, and they also, and I think that is important to remember, made very clear that they didn't want to engage in the same kind of policies than before. The then Commissioner for Enlargement and European Neighborhood Policy, Stefan Füle, made it very explicit that it was a mistake to cooperate unconditionally with authoritarian rulers in the region, and henceforth that was no longer to be done by Europeans. The chance that Europeans saw was that with the tailwind of the Arab uprisings, with people in the region demanding reform, they could actually contribute to sustained stabilization. And in that they made the difference between the old stagnation, the old repressive stability, and sustained stabilization, which would be achieved through reform of the economic and administrative systems, and through more inclusive, more participatory systems in the region. So Europeans pledged to support these transformations basically through what they called a 3M approach. The 3 M's being a combination of monetary support, number one, for political and economic liberalization, 2, market access from the region, and 3, mobility, also from the region towards Europe, and all of that in a reinvigorated European neighborhood policy framework. Because it took place in that framework that already existed as a framework of European foreign policy, it also meant that the focus would be on the immediate neighborhood, that is the southern and the eastern Mediterranean. And of course, on top of that, a lot of European member states established different bilateral programs. Now, when we look at the outcome of European policies 5 years later, and I want to do that by looking at basically 3 points. One is the direct support for transformation that Europeans gave or tried to give. The second one is conditionality. And the third one is European engagement in conflict management. When we go to the first point, the question of support for transformation, and we look at the region, we see that Europeans had an influence only in one case, and that is in Tunisia. Because only in Tunisia, the European instruments that they have available could be adequately employed, if you want so. So the instruments that the Europeans have, election monitoring, diplomacy, civil society support to accompany transition processes, can work, but they can only work in an environment where you already have an elite consensus, or that is going towards an elite consensus for political reform, where these instruments do make sense. And they do not work, as was the case in the other transformation countries, in situations where you have fierce power struggles. There, Europeans can hardly have an influence in trying to gear that towards more inclusive policies. Now, I'm a little bit hesitant to say that Tunisia is a success story, and that has been said throughout the conference a couple of times. I think, of course, Tunisia hasn't seen state collapse. It hasn't seen the fierce violence that we have witnessed in other states, but it's only the first steps of transition that have been taken in Tunisia, and I am actually very concerned that the further steps that would translate the rather progressive constitution into a political and an economic reality in which people feel that they have more freedoms than before, that second step might not come, might not follow, and that concern, of course, is fed by a leadership consensus that is not geared towards reform, that is geared towards maintaining privileges of the ruling elite. When we look at shortcomings of European policies, I think one point is especially stark, and that is in Tunisia that it wasn't possible for Europeans to make a decisive impact on the economic situation. Europeans were not able to reverse the economic downturn that Tunisia, as other transformation countries have witnessed. They were not able to help reducing the country's substantial socioeconomic disparities, and therefore Tunisia is economically in a very bad situation. It is true that Tunisia profited most from special funds that the Europeans made available, but these funds have all in all been very modest, and they have also not been very focused so that they would have led Tunisians towards more reform in the economic sphere. So that hasn't happened. More generally, when we do not only look at Tunisia but at the region more broadly, there were in the beginning demands for something like a Marshall Plan. The then Foreign Minister of Italy demanded that very forcefully, but that trailed off very rapidly. And that has to be seen against developments in Europe. While we saw an increase in funds on the European level, on the EU level, a lot of those member states that were traditionally involved in EU southern policies were gripped very much by the financial crisis, financial and debt crisis in Europe, so they had to cut back their funding rather than increase it. And that has had substantial impact on the money that Europeans were able to make available to support transformation countries in the region. But it's also the incentives that would have been non-material that were not really put forward by the Europeans. So we have not seen an increase in trade between Europe and transformation countries, even those countries that are quite competitive. So Tunisia's trade with the EU hasn't been augmented in any, well, it hasn't. Even worse, I would say, is that there was a dialogue on mobility, migration, and security, and the Europeans and Tunisians agreed on a so-called mobility partnership. They also did that with Morocco and Jordan, but that didn't lead to an increase in migration towards Europe. It didn't have any positive effects in terms of reducing youth unemployment, for example, in increasing remittances, or any other effect on the economy. And that is, of course, not only because that is a relatively short time period we're looking at, but because these agreements in general are geared towards managing migration, meaning preventing migration rather than increasing migration in any sense that would have an impact in the countries where migration is coming from. With regards to the second point, that is the question of conditionality, I would say that the Europeans set very weak incentives and that they gave very confused signals. Now, the idea was that with this tailwind of the Arab uprisings, with Arabs demanding more freedoms, they could support these demands and thus set incentives for elites in the region to change their cost-benefit analysis and therefore go for democratic reform, go for the rule of law, and change their policies towards democratization. The Europeans call that approach more for more and less for less. So those regimes or those governments in the region who would perform well would get more funds from the Europeans. Those who didn't perform well would get less funds. That didn't work at all. I'll be short. It didn't work well at all because the volumes of the financial incentives were so low, especially if you compare them to what regional players were willing to make available, that it didn't have an impact. It didn't work because they didn't add any immaterial incentives, any kind of strategic relations, for example. It also didn't work because they didn't, in the end, link the disbursements of funds to reform progress. And I could give examples there, but I won't because I don't have the time to do that. Most critically, I would say it didn't work because member states of the European Union clearly had different priorities. And the priorities were very much affected and very strongly affected by the will to augment their foreign trade. But it was also first and foremost a question of the fear of spillover of conflict towards Europe. So the interest in cooperating with authoritarian leaders to curb migration and to prevent terrorism coming to Europe has been the most priority, and that has started basically immediately after the Arab Spring, but has become worse and worse. And we're now back to a situation where Europeans are exactly in the trap of the dilemma that was formulated by Mubarak and his ilk. It's us or chaos, and we're back therefore to cooperating with these leaders, trying to limit the impact of conflict to Europe, with the result that is exactly the opposite result. And in addition is not only increasing the impact of conflict in the region on Europe, but is also destroying European principles, European institutions, and European values. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Our last speaker is Natalia Berenkova. تفضلي.
Thank you.
It's not on, I don't think. Push the button.
Where is it?
Is it on? Huh?
Yeah? Okay. It's working. Thank you. We have been discussing for 3 days that within the last years, the Middle East and North Africa have witnessed significant popular mobilization and politicization of people. And the region saw the increase in weight of civil society organizations, political movements, and also powerful militias with different goals. So this research is aimed at analysis of Russian foreign policy and its changes towards non-governmental actors with transnational agenda. Analyzing the issue, we paid attention to those organizations and movements and structures that are crucial participants of international political process in the Levant and occupy a noticeable position in Russian policy towards the region. So in the 1990s, Russian foreign policy in the Middle East was not active, but since the late 2000s, Russian leadership got in search of new mechanisms to secure its political and economic interests. So establishing relations with different states and governments were seen as good opportunity, and still Russia's policy remains quite multi-directional, and it is usually perceived as its strength. And since that time, it adopted realism as primary guideline in its foreign policy, and that means that it has no preferences in regimes to deal with, and if regimes are stable and predictable. So it's classical realist approach to state and as an integrated whole, where foreign policy isn't influenced by internal politics. Well, I can name a number of most important to my mind theories at current time. It is, of course, Kenneth Walt's neorealist approach, and one more theory that attracted halfway attention of Russian leadership is neo-Marxist Emmanuel Wallerstein's world system theory. So BRICS countries are these kind of semi-periphery. So this also explains the Russian commitment to multipolarity that is actually more complex if one looks at it from a realist perspective. And also, according to current developments, we should note Alexander Dugin's Eurasianism, that is to big extent sheer geopolitics, and that was marginal for most part of 2 decades, and after Ukrainian crisis it gained attention. So what is also important to note is that starting the late 2000s, following economic growth and varied bicolor revolutions on its borders, Russian political leadership started to invest in instruments of soft power, emulating the experience of the West in the days when importance of modern communications and information technologies can't be ignored. The main target group of Russian soft power is, of course, the near abroad and countries of former Soviet Union. In relation to the Middle East, in 2007, the اليوم television network were studied, and the same year witnessed the opening of Ruski Mir fund that was aimed at facilitation of Russian language studies. Despite initial skepticism towards the Arab Spring, in the beginning of uprisings, Russia didn't see any threat to its interests, and its policy was more reactive than proactive. However, with the fall of Muammar Gaddafi and NATO operation in Libya came the understanding that such processes would lead to proliferation of radical groups and negative consequences on Russian economic interests. So this Libyan syndrome caused the Russian hard stance against any foreign involvement to internal crisis. So Libya case is perceived by Russian leadership as a even fracture in international order, an attempt to end tendency of multipolarity, and as a prelude to Ukrainian crisis. So the fear of the Libyan scenario in Syria ultimately put Russia in the camp of those of status quo in the Arab world. So let's turn to actors. Relations with non-state armed actors are not novelty in Russian policy. Speaking about Levant region, glaring example is the case of Hamas and Hezbollah. Contacts with them for a long time have been seen by Moscow as an asset in Arab-Israeli negotiation. Russia recognized interdependence of political issues in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and such movements were considered important actors that should not be excluded from any negotiations. So representative of the Russian Ministry for Foreign Affairs always confirmed the thesis heard by me many times that Russia maintains or establishes relations with any non-governmental actor except those in terrorist list. Notice that can help to understand policies that the decision about recognition of a particular organization as terrorist is made by Supreme Court, and this judicial body can only make decision on the basis of particular organization's activity within the borders of the country. So this principle excludes from the list of interlocutors ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, and all organizations connected to Al-Qaeda. The example when policy to deal with all clash with this terrorist list may be the cause of Mohamed Morsi. On the one hand, he was elected president. On the other hand, he has connection to Muslim Brotherhood. But this terrorist organization by Russian classification, and this issue was reconciled since he represented the Freedom and Justice Party. High-level contacts with Hamas started in 2006. After the party won elections, Hamas delegation arrived to Moscow at the invitation of the president. Succeeding meetings were held in 2007 and 2010. The very first visit caused a massive public outcry and criticism from the the side of the United States, Israel, and pro-Israeli circles in Russia. However, Russian ministry repeatedly confirmed its determination to continue relations. It is often stressed that Hamas's Palestinian phenomenon enjoys a considerable popularity and that is why it should be counted with. Keeping channels of communication with all protagonists led, according to ideas of Russian foreign policy makers, to assist in exchange of signals that cannot be translated by actors openly. So this the alike position of Russia is towards Hezbollah party is seen as a result of the development of political life in Lebanon rather than imported product. In course of Syrian crisis, and especially since the fall of 2014, when Russian diplomats started to arrange inter-Syrian talks in Moscow, meetings with Hezbollah and simultaneous consultations and coordination with Damascus and Tehran demonstrate the acknowledgement of Hezbollah as a separate actor and the party to be talked with about all Lebanese developments, of course. Lately, in talked about interview to Russian newspaper, Naim Qassem said that in recent decade the Russian position became closer to parties, and this is caused by the fact that Russia is moving away from West Israeli axis, and he said that this political understanding promise the cooperation in two directions, firstly on international arena and secondly in the field. Thus, contacts with Hamas and Hezbollah are also a factor in Russian-Israeli bilateral relations that are stable and positive for many reasons, of course. And after it became clear that Russia will step further to Syrian conflict, Benjamin Netanyahu made an urgent visit to Moscow, expressing his anxiety about a positive opening of the second front and transfer of weapons to Hezbollah. And simultaneously, there was an agreement to establish the channel of communication in order to avoid clashes in the air. Since the outbreak of the Syrian crisis, many observers automatically put Russia to so-called resistance axis, but despite all four actors are on the same side of the fence, it is dangerous for Moscow to be involved in any sectarian discourse, and there is no anti-Israeli component. The issue of takfirism in a way also unites Russia with the cause of this group. Since the Chechen conflict, the fear of proliferation of its radical forms remains strong, I mean Islam radical forms. At the same time, Russia has the largest indigenous Muslim population in Europe, which since the 1990s cannot be excluded from the world's trends of Islam development. All radical Salafi groups are seen by Russia as potential threat to the stability inside the country and in Central Asia. Talking to influential armed parties like Hezbollah and Hamas, Russia doesn't close channels of conversation with other parties with opposite positions in Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria, but since that is common diplomatic practice, we will not stop at that. What is new is that the period of Arab Spring and after witnessed the activation of Russian policy towards Christian organizations and churches. The Christian vector reflects the conservative line in domestic politics and growth of influence of Russian Orthodox Church inside. The first that catch the eye of an observer is the drastic rise in number of meetings, high-level meetings with Christian-oriented organizations and religious leadership since 2013. The declared aim of this cooperation is to save people from radicalism and preserve millennia-old traditions of interethnic and interreligious coexistence in the Middle East. In addition to regional diplomatic attempts also were undertaken. Moscow used instruments of the United Nations. In March 2015, at the initiative of Russia, Vatican, and Lebanon, in the course of the UN Human Rights Council session, the joint statement called to joint action and addressing alarming situation in the Middle East were taken. So some Russian NGOs also work in the Middle East and have agenda in the religious field. First of all, we should name the work of Imperial Orthodox Palestine society that now have several projects in Syria, and worth mentioning the activity of state under the First Gulf Fund. In their rhetoric about Christian suffering in the Middle East, Russian officials stepped from time to time in the civilizational discourse, in contrast to liberal rhetoric focused on freedom of speech, individual and minority rights, democracy, what are perceived as universal values. Russian discourse proposes a conservative alternative and addresses traditional religious communities, both Muslim and Christian. That's why from time to time Russian officials on the wave of trade relations go even further in their rhetoric, accusing Europe of aggressive secularism and of shifting away from their civilizational foundation, and so on and so forth. Such discourse is the result of Russian domestic conservative turn, as I have already mentioned, and recent attempts to gain an idea in its foreign policy that could be proposed to others. Eventually, on the one hand, defense of Middle Eastern Christians are seen as historic mission of Russia and resembles in collective psyche with the role it played in the past. On the other hand, the promotion of essentialist and civilizational approach can turn to be impracticable because of multi-confessional nature of Russian society and its conceptual stance for multipolarity in international relations. So increased turbulence in international arena of the last 5 years brought many changes to Russian foreign strategy. Arab Spring activated Russian policy in the Middle East and Levant in particular, and intensified contacts with non-governmental actors with international reach. Arab Spring demonstrated once again and very clearly that traditional realist or neo-realist approach to international relations couldn't work well alone. Relations between nations are determined by relations of their people, and Western countries are champions in that sphere. After the deterioration in relation with the West and its turn eastward, Russia found itself in search for ideological background for its foreign policy and in search for new instruments of action also. So in regards to the Middle East, such idea was found in support for brotherly Christian communities, despite the fact that Russia kept and even intensified its contacts with non-state actors. The policy in Syria still clearly shows that states are still preferable partners Russia feels comfortable with. So, I'm done.
Thank you very much. We'll open it up now for about half an hour of 25 minutes of questions and answers and comments, and then we will have the closing comments by Dr. Mitri. Hold your hands up. I would ask, please, identify yourself. Try to ask a brief question or make a brief comment. Don't try to ask 2 or 3 questions, because after the first question, the lights will go off. So go ahead.
هنا نخال صحفية. أنا كنت بس حابة أطلب من الأستاذ بوز الدين والأنسة براتو إنه لو يقدموا لنا شوي خلاصة عن دراستهم يلي لاحظت تأثير التدخل الأجنبي من الدول المجاورة، لأنه مع احترامنا للبانل أهمية الدراسات عن الدور الأوروبي والروسي والأمريكي، بهمنا كمان نعرف أكثر عن دور الدول الإقليمية المجاورة لنا مثل إيران وتركيا. شكرا كثير. Thank you.
تفضل. Then we'll come back here. There's microphone, please, up here.
Thank you very much.
It's on. Just point it straight at you.
Thank you very much. What I would like to ask concerns something that has not been mentioned, so it might sound a little bit offbeat. However, none of the speakers mentioned anything about interests of multinationals. We've not heard anything about Rosneft, about ExxonMobil. When Dr. Jazayerli, I think, was talking, he was quoting various pundits, various knowledgeable people, I'm sure, but there was nothing mentioned about economic interests and what European firms were wanting to sell to Iran, etc. Another issue, the last one, I promise, is that I haven't heard anything mentioned throughout this meeting about efforts to return the loot that has been stashed by various governments, various leaders in this region, mainly in European banks, I expect. The loot that has been stashed in foreign banks, mainly European banks, it's estimated to be around $700 billion. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody on this side? Okay, there's one in the middle, then, yeah, the lady in the middle, then we'll come back here.
Thank you. My name is Zmil, and thank you. And my question goes to Felicia and Fouad. It's very interesting how you put this, and I wanted to ask, what is your take about the first, like at the beginning when the uprisings happened, there was also a kind of sense of the more international coverage and the more US seems to be involved, the more secure those on the streets will be. So I would say that to an extent there was also, I think maybe also Syria is making like not intervention, like there was never a hope of intervention, but there was also an idea of, oh, I'd feel more secure if we are out there in the news and if you really listen to us and have us, and it gave a higher sense of security. So maybe what you do out of that.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question and then we'll give the speakers a chance to comment, and we'll go for another round. I'd like to ask Natalia. The Chinese are making quite a dramatic entrance into the Middle East this week, actually. They've been doing a lot of things behind the scenes. The Russians are trying to have been working closely with the Iranians, the Egyptians, and the Saudis, arms sales and other things. Do you see a Russian, Chinese, American competition growing in the region, in the economic level, the military level, and therefore the political level?
I think that in a way, yes. There are growing Russian interests in the region, and from my point of view, it's primarily economic. Of course, a kind of alliance between Russia and China, it is probably just temporary, but still there is a lot of intention to continue this cooperation, but still, if we talk about China, its instruments is also, it's of course generally economics. It doesn't interfere much in regional affairs politically. So China, yeah, it is will be the growing factor, of course, in the future.
Do you want to start down there?
Sure.
But use the mic, please.
First. Okay. With regards to the question about neighbors' influences, that was not the specific focus of our studies, but I can say that what we did see was what you would expect to see. Those nations that have historically troubled relations with their neighbors tended to see those relations as more troublesome for the uprisings as well. In response to your question, Dr. Bizri, we did talk about the multinational corporations very briefly. And I, in general, was speaking about foreign intervention and external influence very broadly, including such non-state actors as multinational corporations. And in terms of whether international media presence at the beginning of the uprisings made people feel safer, I think that's a complicated question, and I think it has something to do with the stage at which you find yourself under the spotlight, so to speak. So in our argument, we argue that if you're going to launch a process of democratization, before you get to the point of tension and conflict, then influence is not a good idea. Once you're at the point where there's polarization already, there's a possibility of repression and crackdowns, which we saw, alliances and allegiances are immediately a strategic and a tactical choice that people look to. Whether that's a great idea, strategically or tactically, depends on the context.
I'll say one more thing. We are asking about influence of multinationals on our own thing, but to elaborate on your question about what his coverage is, what do publics read, they're really, my subjective sense in the United States is a big change. The notion that Arabs would want to be democratic was news to a lot of Americans, but they were very thrilled about it. And but you know, neocons, and they're the pundits, and some of the people in the government would like to say, ooh, 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 what if they're not under our thumb like they have been lately? No. But as we showed in our talk, we think that they were just generally optimistic because their experiences, you know, revolutions always work. As long as they're not communists, that doesn't tend to bother Americans. So, you know, but there's also a lingering stereotype that's going to come in, which is Arabs don't know what democracy is, and they're just violent anyway, and they can never sort out their politics. And you see, I'm using the word there, because that is the sense, I think, even among people who feel very awful about what's happening in Syria. And there are U.S. Americans who do, as well as lots of Canadians who are actually doing good things to welcome refugees. At least I think, though, there's a moment, and I don't think it's just a moment. I've been sad when I've heard people at the conference say, well, we don't know, it's failed or it's all over. History is not over. It's not over. There's lots of cause for hope, even though there's also lots of cause for mourning. I'm done.
I'd like to add something on the question on economic interests. I think when we look at Europe, it's very obvious that security interests come first. But then economic interests do play a role. And we see that very clearly when we look at European-Egyptian relations. There was a very clear, unanimous assessment of the situation in Egypt after the coup and the massacres that took place. And the EU took the decision to review the security cooperation with Egypt, to review the bilateral assistance, the EU assistance to Egypt. And that wasn't upheld very long. And the main reason why it changed was security interest in security cooperation, re-engaging with the Sisi regime. And the second one were economic interests, I would hold. And it was obvious that in Germany, a very large deal, the largest deal ever for one of the German companies, was signed with Egypt. And it was in that context that the Egyptian president was invited to come to Berlin, thereby giving him legitimacy, even though he had not fulfilled some of the conditions that the German chancellor herself had put up before, and that is that parliamentary elections should have happened before he comes to Germany. So you see, there are instances where economic interests actually do play a role in getting back to policies that apparently before we had said we don't want to engage in anymore.
I have very brief comment to your question also. You mentioned Rosneft, and I think that for Russian big companies it is also more comfortable to deal with stable states because they work on the inertia. So the capitalism is not quite old in Russia. So that's why it is just signing of framework agreement between governments, and they come to friendly atmosphere and work there, then rather than go to unknown field and explore how to work here. So that's why.
Yes. Okay, several points came up. First of all, concerning your point about pundits, do you take President Obama to be a pundit? I cited him at several instances. The President of the U.S. is not a pundit. He's the man who is representing the policy of his state. I compared what he was saying to what big thinkers about strategy were saying. So that's first concerning pundits. About multinational and economic interests, that goes without saying. When we are talking about capitalist institutions, I mean, I don't need to state the obvious about the relationship between politics and economics. And by the way, I said in my paper, I said, despite what Mearsheimer is saying about, you know, the need close down and let's leave, I said the United States is not going to leave the Gulf, and I said the United States is not turning its back on the Middle East and is not going to withdraw from it. Why? Because as several analysts have pointed out, even if now the U.S. is no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil, actually the United States just started, about a month ago, started exporting oil, and this hasn't been the case since '69. So even though it does not need the oil of the Middle East, it's not going to leave the door open for China to come in and sit in its place. I mean, even Mearsheimer himself said, you know, that would be incredibly stupid for them. So I'm always amazed about all these people who appear on TV, whether in the Middle East and or Europe, and say, oh, the United States is no longer interested in the Middle East. Oh, okay, all right. Well, come on. Okay, so yeah, of course it's interested in the Middle East, and that interest is economic, because the next confrontation, which is not going to be military, it's going to be with China, it's going to be an economic confrontation. So the United States has to stay there for that reason. Again, I did not talk about economics because I thought I don't need to state the obvious. Now, about the loot, I don't know if you are talking about the loot in Syria or the loot in Iraq.
All over.
Okay, so...
Can I just mention...
Go ahead.
I did not say specifically that Obama was a pundit, but you mentioned several...
Yeah, well, of course, we have, that's the point, that's the point of the study. The point of the study is to show, I said at the opening, I said there is a strategy, here are some of the big strategic thinkers, and let's now compare it with what Obama is saying. Because it's not just, Obama doesn't set policy. It's, as Michael Hayden just said it 3 weeks ago on Al Jazeera. He said it so clearly. He said there is something called, and I was fascinated that this is the first American, but Michael Hayden, by the way, for the people who don't know him, he was a former head of the CIA. I've never heard an American state it so clearly when he said there is something called al-hukuma al-da'ima. That's how Al Jazeera translated his statement in English. So there is somebody setting policy. It's not just Obama speaking about for himself. He's speaking as a head of a state, and I was comparing to just one thing. So loot, Iraq, you probably have heard hundreds of pieces of historic pieces, archaeological pieces have been returned. Syria, we have to wait until see what's going to happen to it, and then we're going to start talking about loot. I want to just one last thing about intervention. Question here and to the audience. I haven't heard a single Syrian who was opposed to intervention. Now, I'm not saying they don't exist, but the ones that I'm in contact with, not just in the Middle East, in Syria, but also among the Syrian community in the United States, I haven't heard a single one who was against intervention. The place where I've heard against intervention is articles mainly by leftists. Now, I know this is a very controversial topic, but I'm going to ask the people who are theorizing and talking about intervention to please put themselves at the receiving end of the barrel bombs, or what Gaddafi said, zanga zanga, as he was getting ready to. So I understand that, there is a politically correct way to talk about intervention, etc., and how the consequences, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And I myself understand all the complications to it. But at the same time, I want somebody to please go and sit someplace in Aleppo or in Libya and theorize to me from there and give us your opinion, especially once you lose your son or your family. all of them, they just disappear under it. Go ahead.
Can I just...
But we don't want to have too much...
He made me sound as though I'm asking for intervention.
Okay, you can clear it up.
I'm sorry. This is not directed to you. I said, talking intervention.
Afterwards, go ahead, Muriel.
Just one point on that, because I think it's important. When we look at interventions over the last 5 years, I don't see any humanitarian intervention at all. And I think that it's important to take into account that people might ask for humanitarian intervention, but what they get is not humanitarian intervention.
There is no such thing as a humanitarian intervention. It does not exist.
Well, I agree with that. But what you are saying is people want others to intervene to stop, for example, barrel bombing.
I'm not saying I want. I am saying what I have heard from people who have lived in these places, whether it's in Libya or in Syria. I'm not stating a case for intervention. I'm giving a response to the paper and to the discussion that have been going about intervention. As a political scientist, I'm not a political scientist, you are, right? We all know that states are not charitable institutions. Okay, states pursue their interests. Okay, so there's no such thing as a humanitarian intervention. States intervene when they see it is in the interest, whether it's economic, political, etc. Nobody, do you really think that Angela Merkel is receiving 1 million Syrians because she's being charitable?
No, of course not, but that's a different question.
Yeah, and the area of the world, the Middle East, which has the most number of people in direct need of emergency aid in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and many other places, Palestine, Gaza, other places, seems to be the place where the rest of the world has completely forgotten about the idea of the right to protect and just completely refuses to deal with it. So there is a moral issue here as well as a realpolitik issue. Another round of questions? Here? Speak into the mic. Yeah, just point it out.
Working?
Yes.
Yeah. I had a few questions, perhaps the
but
first
just
is
ask one, please. Pick the most important one.
Very quick.
Pick the most important one so that everybody gets a chance.
It's to the European German, about Germany's role within Europe as being dominant and about the contradictions within the European Union concerning intervention. And the question you mentioned about Tunisia, it's because Germany, I mean, you said Europe managed to do something. It's because of Germany's role, I think, because I think Germany had invested a lot in Tunisia. And I have a very quick question to the Russian.
We don't have time for more than one. I'm sorry. If there's any other questions? Okay, go ahead, and then we turn it over to Dr. Tarek Mitri. I apologize for the, we have to stick to the time. If people would like to answer that?
Okay, very quickly, I don't think you can say that Germany is dominant in Europe. Germany is dominant in some areas. That is the economy, that's the financial game, the very ugly things that we've seen over the last 5 years. But of course, Germany is not dominant when it comes to military action, for example. Then Germany is very small, and it's been the French and the British that have been driving European interventions in the region, in Libya, in Mali, and also, of course, now in Syria and Iraq, not humanitarian interventions. I do think that Germany did play a larger role in Tunisia, and that was because it was, if you want so, not tainted by a colonial past in North Africa. So it made it much easier to be viewed positively. But then again, talk to a lot of Tunisians, they see the German role not as positive at all, because they would tell you that Germany was very strongly pushing for the Brotherhood to take on a prominent role, and they facilitated that. So yes, they did take on a role, but it was viewed very differently by different parts of the Tunisian population.
Dr. Tarek Mitri, please.
Sorry, I'd like to respond to the comment about interventions, because I think it relates to our paper.
And then Tarek.
We did mention that in our poll data, we don't find that among the citizens' primary demands that Arab publics are married to the idea of sovereignty. We did say, for example, that the surveys that we did were in 2011, 2012, before the Syrian situation became dire. In general, what our argument is that foreign influences on the development of political processes indigenously and domestically, before they get to the point of conflict and to the point where geostrategic and the major power strategy and other considerations become an issue, there is still foreign influence. And that influence has negative effects on domestic politics and on the psychology of publics that are experiencing that influence. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. No, keep your seats. No microphone.
Thank you very much for a great panel, and I appreciate the fact that you've accepted to be the last panelists in a 3 days conference, a very busy conference, speak on Saturday evening, and see people leaving the room. That did not affect your ability to continue discussing. I'm amazed by the ability of the audience to engage with panelists in this conference. This is not my first conference, and I'm genuinely amazed at how interested the audience seems to be on every issue that was raised in those 3 days. I'm not making a speech, only a few minutes. It's mandatory to say something before we disperse in peace. That's all. So it's basically niceties and words of thanks and everything. So, and they will be in Arabic, if you don't mind. سررنا بكم جميعا في هذا المؤتمر، وأخص منكم الذين أتوا إلينا من بلاد بعيدة أو الذين أتوا إلى بيروت لأول مرة، وقد التقيت عددا من الذين لم يزوروا بيروت من ذي قبل، فلهؤلاء يعني كلمة محبة وترحيب خاصة. وأخص أيضا الذين يشاركون في مؤتمر كهذا لأول مرة. لقد سعدنا بوجود عدد من الباحثين الشباب، وهذا ما أعطى لمؤتمرنا حيوية نفتقدها أحيانا كثيرة في المؤتمرات العلمية. كان البرنامج كثيفا وساعات العمل طويلة، اعذرونا. حشرنا الكثير في أيام 3، إلا أن النقاش كان ثريا، والمشاركة في النقاش جاءت واسعة، مما يشي بأن الأوراق التي قدمت وفقت لا في إغنائنا بالمعلومات فحسب، بل أيضا في تقديم الفرضيات وفي تحميلنا بالأسئلة. خلال الأيام 3 الماضية وصلتنا تعليقات كثيرة واقتراحات، وسيردنا المزيد منها. شكرا لهذا الاهتمام. البعض رأى أن عدد الأوراق والمتدخلين كبير، وأن المؤتمر طويل، فيما البعض الآخر شكى من النقص في تشكيلة المشاركين لجهة البلدان والاختصاصات والخبرات والأعمار، وأراد أن نبقى معا أكثر من أيام 3. عملنا جاهدين لسد النواقص، لم نحترم نسبا محددة بين المشاركين من بلدان، لأن أعطينا الأولوية كما ذكرت لكم في بداية مؤتمرنا للاقتراحات الواردة إلينا. وجهنا دعوة عامة وفوجئنا بأن مشاريع الأوراق التي اقترحت علينا فاقت توقعاتنا، واضطررنا بطبيعة الحال كما هي الحال في مؤتمرات علمية أن نغربل الاقتراحات وأن نعهد بهذه المهمة الجليلة لمجموعة من الأساتذة المحكمين من الجامعة الأمريكية في بيروت أو من معهد الدوحة. وأغتنم الفرصة ها هنا لأشكرهم لأنهم ساعدونا باختيار الأنسب. ربما لم يختاروا بالضرورة الأفضل، على الأرجح اختاروا الأفضل، لكنهم في كل الحالات اختاروا الأنسب. سنتعامل باحترام مع كل الأفكار النقدية التي عرضت أثناء هذا المؤتمر، وستكون محل دراستنا بما فيها تلك الانتقادات التي تفتقر إلى الإنصاف والمستعجلة في إطلاق الأحكام، كالذي سمعناه بالأمس عن أن استبعدنا بلدانا بعينها بسبب من تأثيرات دولة بعينها. هذا كلام غير صحيح وغير منصف، وقد بينا بصراحة وببساطة ذلك لقائله وللجميع. يبدو لي أن مؤتمرنا غطى مساحات واسعة من البحث ومن التأمل. كنا أحيانا نتناقش كباحثين، لكن الأسئلة التي تدافعت وتكاثرت علينا دفعتنا أيضا أحيانا لوقفة تأمل. وأنا أحسن ما أسمعه في مؤتمرات كهذا هو اضطرار الباحث لأن يقول لا أعرف، ربما، سنرى. وقد سمعت هذا أكثر من مرة، وهذا على الأقل فيما يعنيني أمر مطمئن. غطينا مساحات واسعة من البحث والتأمل. انشغلت بطبيعة الحال مؤتمرنا بتعميق معرفتنا بما شهدته بلادنا، وكان لابد من التذكير أن ما شهدناه في السنوات الخمس الماضية لم يكن متوقعا ولا مدروسا، لأن الكثير من مجتمعاتنا تجهل نفسها، وهذا يأمرنا بالتواضع، لأننا كما لم نتوقع ما جرى فإننا الآن لا نستطيع إطلاق الأحكام بتسرع ولا بارتياح. لذلك ظلت الأسئلة عن المآلات، وهي في عنوان المؤتمر، أي عن الإمكانات والاحتمالات الآتية، ظلت أسئلة معلقة. لم يجازف أحد منا، والحمد لله، في الحديث عن المستقبل بثقة، وهذا بالطبع غير مستغرب. اعترفنا من اليوم الأول أن، على الأقل في كلمتي التمهيدية، أن العنوان المزدوج تحيط بكلماته أو بمصطلحاته الغشاوة، وهو يحتمل الالتباس. وقلت أنه لا يقوم على فرضية نظرية مسبقة. لسنا حين نظمنا هذا المؤتمر لم ننطلق من نظرية بعض علماء السياسة حول التحول الديمقراطي، ولا من وصفتي الأمم المتحدة. أنا خدمت الأمم المتحدة وأعني ما أقول، المتعلقة بالانتقال الديمقراطي أو بالتحول الديمقراطي. لم يكن هذا في بالنا قط. لعل الكلمة الأساس التي كانت تهمنا في هذين العنوانين هي عبارة عسر. فضلتها مع الزملاء على تعثر، لأن بعد العسر يسرا، على أمل أن نتجاوز هذا العسر. لكن طبعا الكل تحدث عن تعثر ثوراتنا، وتحدث الكثيرون عن إخفاقاتنا، ولم يخفي البعض إحساسه العميق بالفشل، وهو حق لكل منا، ثائرا كان أم غير ثائر. لعل ما تداولنا به في الأوراق والمناقشات، وهي غنية جدا المناقشات، سيكون مادة منشورة طبيعة الحال، إلا أن الأهم من ذلك هو المسائل التي سنستخرجها أو نستخلصها أو نستعبرها من مناقشاتنا، لكي تسمح لنا لاحقا بحديث عن المستقبل. سيظل الحديث عن المستقبل صعبا، رجاؤنا أن يكون نقاشنا هذه المرة قد مهد له بعض الشيء، ولعله أيضا نقاشنا ألقى الضوء على ما أغفلنا دراسته من جوانب واقعنا، أو ما لم يتيسر لنا الغوص في مسائله. عنيت الكثير مما يتصل بشؤون المجتمع. إحدى المشاركات الصديقات قالت لي: طغى التحليل السياسي على التحليل السوسيولوجي، وأعتقد في هذا الكلام نصيب من الصحة. لكن أيضا لم نتحدث في شؤون الاقتصاد إلا قليلا، سؤال من هنا ووريقة من هناك، ولم نتحدث في شؤون الثقافة. البعض منا تحدث عن القيم، عن المشاعر، عن التصورات، وهو كان بمثابة لبعضنا نسمة هواء عليلة. لكن لم نفي المسألة الثقافية، مسألة القيم، التصورات، التمثلات. أنا إذا زرتم مكتبي على طاولتي هناك كتاب أصدره المركز العربي للأبحاث ودراسة السياسات، فيه صور، معظمه صور عن الشهور الستة الأولى من الثورة السورية، من الجرافيتي، من صور المظاهرات، الرقص، الغناء، وهذا وجه مهم من وجوه ما اختبرناه في هذه السنوات الأخيرة، ويستحق اهتماما خاصا إن شاء الله بالمستقبل. كما أسهمت أبحاثنا وحواراتنا في هذا المؤتمر بشكل أولي في حصر المسائل وتحديدها وضبط اصطلاحاتها. أنا أعرف أن الكثيرين يبدأون، لا سيما بيننا نحن معشر العرب، يبدأون بالحديث عن المصطلحات وضرورة ضبطها، وأحترم هذا، لكن ويعملون. أما علماء السياسة أو علماء الاجتماع فكمان ينزعون إلى مقارنة المصطلحات حسب مدارس العلوم الإنسانية. هذا كله مهم، لكن في ظني الأهم من المدلول هو الدال، أن نفهم الدال ونستنطقه. في ظني أهم من أن نصرف جهدا كبيرا في هذه المسائل. ستبقى المصطلحات مشوبة ببعض الغموض، ستبقى محط سجال. هل نحن أمام تحول أم تغير؟ هل هي ثورة أم انتفاضة؟ هذا النقاش لن يتوقف، لكن لا يستحق أن يستغرق كل جهودنا. لن نتسرع في أمر المتابعة، لكننا سنتابع العمل. سوف نتدارس صيغة المتابعة استنادا إلى خبرة هذا المؤتمر. قد لا ندعو لمؤتمر كبير مثل هذا، إلا أننا قد ننظم ندوات أصغر متخصصة أكثر في مسائل أثيرت هنا. تبقى لي كلمتان، أولهما قولي أن المؤسستين اللتين دعتا إلى هذا المؤتمر ونظمتاه، أي الجامعة الأمريكية في بيروت معهد السياسات، والمركز العربي للإبحاث ودراسة السياسات في الدوحة، أن هذان الهيئتان عملتا بانسجام قل نظيره وبروح زمالة نعتز بها، وهو ما يعد بتعاون مستمر إن شاء الله. أما كلمتي الثانية والأخيرة فهي الشكر من أعماق القلب لفريق العاملين في الجامعة الأمريكية وفي المركز العربي للبحث والدراسات ودراسة السياسات. لن أسميهم فردا فهم كثر، فهن كثيرات، ولن أعدد أفضالهن. قالت العرب: الفضل يعرفه ذووه. بارك الله فيهم جميعا لكل ما قدموه وللابتسامات التي لم تفارق شفاههن. والسلام عليكم. Thank you.